So for the second technique video, I'm just going to look at modeling in two parts. First, how to create some of these individual elements and some of the very cheap tricks that I use. And the second part of modeling is sort of how to bring it together. And then the third part will be shading, which, will be surprisingly easy to most people. But with that being said, let's get right in there. So I'm just going to close this up. Now I'm going to create some of the individual elements and just show you very quickly how I work when I'm creating sort of these UI type things. And I usually, as you probably noticed by now, I use a lot of modifiers to model. It's not that I can't poly model. I'm just not very fast at it. I've never really practiced it that much. So I try to use a lot of sort of really quick and easy ways to get around that and to do interesting things with it. So first thing I'm going to do is just create a cube, and I'm going to set it to the bottom. There we go. And a lot of the little sort of extra details and things that you see in that shot are based on very, very simple geometric shapes. And a lot of these techniques can be applied to pretty much any of the individual elements that you see in the final video. So the first thing I like to do is just a very, very simple cube. I'm going to add in a wireframe modifier, bring that down. I'm going to turn off replace original, and there we go. So you'll see once we get into the shading that we now have these really simple elements that we can shade very, very quickly. And I'll talk about that a little bit more once we get there. So again, if you want to create some more interesting looking things, you can always add something like an array. And let's set it to like 1.5. And if you, let's say, have 8 of these objects and you copy the array and you set it to the Y offset, then already you have a grid and you can create these really, really, simple looking objects very quickly. But once you combine that with the shading that we'll do, you'll see that it becomes really interesting. It looks very UI-like. So again, this is probably going to be a fairly quick video because, like I said, once you open the source file and have a look at it, you'll see that a lot of these elements are just very, very simple, and a lot of it comes down to the shading itself and, just placing them in there. So in that same vein, let me just grab another cube really quickly. And I like to hit like GZ.1 very quickly. That means my pivot point is in the middle and the bottom of my cube, so I can place it on the ground very easily by hitting Alt G and then hitting G and Shift Z, so I can move it around on the ground plane. So little things like this are very important to keep your workflow going quickly. And if you have sort of your end product in mind, make sure that you derive all these elements and create all of these elements in the correct way so you can actually do some interesting things with it. So again, I have another little wireframe thing here that I want to use. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm actually, rather than subdividing it here, I'll go back out, I'm going to subdivide it here. And setting this to simple will allow me to just subdivide it very, very easily. So now we could even do the same and add a wireframe in there. And depending on what you want, you can turn this replace original on and off. It will keep or replace the original mesh. But I didn't really use something similar to this, but I just want to show you this very quickly as well. It's really cool what you can do, because let's say if we add in a solidify here and we add that in between, you can make sure that it's set to even thickness, and then you could have this really interesting element. And as you can see, if you put the solidify inside, the mesh will actually error out, but it's not really the end of the world because you get these really interesting looking patterns within the original mesh. So if I turn down the subdivisions a little bit, hopefully you can see it, you get this sort of cross pattern when you push the solidify inwards. If you push it outwards, you get a nice sort of looking mesh. And like I said, everything is just variation on this theme, and I use a lot of techniques very similar to this in the UI video. So here is one of the last ones. So I'm going to create a UV sphere here, and I'm going to subdivide it a little bit more extreme, but that way we get something interesting to work with. So another one that I really, really like using when it comes to modifiers is if I grab this edge split here and I set the split angle to 0, then you won't really see anything, but now all of these individual polygons are broken apart, so they're not attached to each other, which means if we add something like a smooth modifier, you'll see they'll break up, and we can easily control the factor or how much they're breaking up. And if you have that image in mind, or the technique video in mind, you can see this is how I create sort of these really interesting looking spheres. It's how I created the one of the spheres for the world in the middle. And again, you could do the same thing. You could add a solidify to this, and or not even a solidify. If we add it, actually we add it before the smooth, and we get this double layer, and we get these really, really interesting results. And you can just keep going. Turn off the fill rim so you can get just a double layer of little planes. And like I said, you could even add in another solidify on top of this if you wanted to give them thickness. So you get these really, really crazy elements very quickly. And it's more in terms of thinking like with edges or with points or with polygons, rather than thinking of the shape as in its entirety. Just think of all the edges and verts and polygons as individual shapes you can manipulate with all these modifiers, and then really, really interesting results pop up. If I delete that last solidify and just bring down the factor a little bit, so we have slightly larger polygons still. Again, we could add an wireframe to this, and be sure to turn off even thickness because it sometimes wigs out when you're using very small geometry. And as you can see, now we have this super technical pattern. Again, turn off replace original, and now we can shade both the polygons and the individual edges as different things. So this is just an idea of how I created most of them. I've left all of the elements in the technique shot untouched. I haven't applied any of these modifiers, so you can just have a look at them, play around with them, and see what happens. And again, I just like being able to make these procedural, so if I want more detail in this one, then we can just add in a little bit more detail. Yeah, the solidify pushes out these edges a little bit, and they're not as subdivided, or they don't, align perfectly, but it doesn't really matter. If it's just a small UI element somewhere and it looks cool, then I doubt anybody will, call you up and say, hey, your edges weren't really correct on that one. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter, especially if you're animating this stuff. Keep it simple, keep it quick, and it's more about adding a lot more of these elements and animating some of them together, rather than having this one master element that just looks completely crazy. I mean, for example, if I just duplicate this and put it in the same place, if I just, let's see, scale it down just a little bit, and I'm gonna solo this for a second so I'm in local view so I can just see this one. Take away all these modifiers. If I add in something like a decimate modifier, and I'll take away the edge split as well, go to like 0.1, and this is a style that I didn't necessarily use because I wanted everything to be a little more straight. But again, you get these really, really interesting patterns very quickly. And you do the same thing, add in a wireframe, bring it down, turn off replace original, and this is another element. So if I go back in, we have this secondary element within our sphere, and if you look at the final file, you'll see there's multiple elements that are layered together to give a really, really complex look. But I did it in a very easy way. I think I spent about maybe 5 or 6 hours in total on the entire shot from start to finish. So that goes to show, once you get the hang of some of these techniques, you can iterate very, very quickly on this type of work. So that's it for this video. I'll move on to the next one to show you how we can combine this with particle systems to very quickly create very interesting and intricate looking patterns.